Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Life Hacks with Art. When Malika and Shalini called me up to talk about art, I wondered how a 45-minute segment could potentially answer any question. But we finally zeroed in on the most fundamental yet fairly unanswerable question, which is what is art and why is it art? So I'm going to urge you to add two words to this question. What is art to you? And I'm requesting you to keep this question as a guiding thought through the webinar because chances are you might change the answer for yourself after our speakers have spoken. I've been in the art world for over 15 years, and in all my interactions with art, I have often been puzzled, confused, and intrigued by what I saw. So there have been a few constants in my journey, and I'm going to share those with you. The first is that if there is any emotive experience to a work, it could be love, hate, confusion, disgust, they're all legitimate feelings. If it moved you in any way, it's possibly the time you should ask about the context of the work, the artist's practice, and perhaps a little bit more about who they are. In working over the last 15 years, the other thing that I have learned is um, would this artwork be relevant 100 years from now? And is the artist consistent with their thought and practice? The best way, or so we thought, of offering perspectives is to ask artists themselves about the why, what drives them, and how perhaps we can align with their way of seeing the world. So I requested world-renowned artists Jitish and Reena Kallat were right here to share with us their journeys and about why they make the art that they do. The scale of these questions are really large, and 40 minutes may not do it justice. However, I hope you're left a little bit more intrigued and a little bit more desirous of engaging with art the next time you see it. So here it is to Jitish and Reena. Jitish and Reena, welcome to our YPO webinar. We're all very excited to hear you and see your studios. I think the first question that I'd like to take everybody through is, what is your life before you became artists? So could we start with Jitish, please?
Hi, thanks, Aparajita, and hello, everybody. It's great to welcome you virtually at a time when we're all isolated. This is a great way to kind of virtually kind of de-isolate ourselves from each other and connect. This is really not our main studio. So this is an alternate studio right across the street from my home. So there isn't all the art that we would have loved to share, but but at least it's a context in which we still continue to work. We come here every day. Just thinking about our early days. Of course, life before art. Well, that's a big question. What comes first when you really look back at your life? When I think back, everything began for me at age 5. Standing beside my sister. That memory is so sort of distinctly etched in my mind at this moment, because I think the family's recalled it so many times as well. I was making this drawing while my sister was struggling to make her biology lesson class. I was standing beside her. She was 8 years older than me. I was age 5. And somehow the family just felt that this drawing seemed better than what my sister was doing. And my sister was so excited that she called all her friends. And I became the go-to guy where all the older girls would come to make their drawings. And I think little did they or I realize that this action of just drawing for my sister at age 5 would become a lifelong obsession. It just, I would draw and draw. And I think, drawing is this very powerful instrument. You just draw a line, extend it, you take a paper which is just space, but those two lines make it a place because you can put a figure in there. And you suddenly feel that a few lines can generate a world. And as a young kid, that's a very powerful moment, to sort of experience the world emerge on paper. That then took me to art school. Of course, my dad and mom never really questioned this decision to become an artist, and I'm eternally thankful to them. Walking through this large room and going upstairs, I think the decision to be an artist and this feeling that one is in the exact place that one wanted to be was actually more olfactory. I could almost smell the oil paint and know that this is what I wanted to smell for the rest of my life. So that's really the journey, AJ, in a short form, really, from early days.
Reena, would you take us through a little bit of your life before?
Yeah, welcome guys on a Saturday morning. It's lovely to be, even though we're distant from each other, it's so nice to be able to connect. Thinking of my early years, Pratha, as you know, it was such a natural sort of need and desire to constantly keep, making drawings and also making a lot of other works like with paper mache. I did a lot of hand work, whether it was embroideries, whether it was dyeing, printing, and these were things that I always thought I was passionate about and never really saw it as a profession. So while everybody in school thought that, that was the sort of most obvious step to take, I kept thinking of doing medicine because I'd lost my mother when I was really young. And somehow in those years, I believed that, as I grow up, I'm going to look for a cure for cancer. And I had several interests. I mean, I loved child psychology, I loved journalism, dramatics. And my father was the one who really encouraged me into taking up the arts because he felt I would be giving up all my interests in the arts for medicine. So it was really unlike a conservative parent. He was the one who really, sort of recognized it very early.
I think one of the questions that I've always been intrigued by is what drives your art practice? And I mean, I'd like you to individually answer this, but Jitish, we'd like to begin with you. What can you encapsulate your practice in this question?
I think in terms of what motivates or drives us, I think each of us are trying to make meaning of the world and the life around us. And each of us somehow feel intrinsically endowed to do it with particular faculties. So for somebody, it might be numbers and mathematics as a way to sort of abstract the world. A musician simply reorganizes sound and it becomes music. And the moment you reorganize the world, you understand something about the world. And to me, I think I'm a visual thinker, so I think this becomes a way for me to really think through the world, but also the way you arrange information, not just a form, but what does that form symbolically mean? Thinking back, and I think I only sort of got some clarity of this wide tendencies in my work in broad strokes when I actually did the retrospective in 2017 at NGMA. I think seeing an entire life work together, I began to feel that there are probably two gestures that I make in the work. And those are gestures all of us do every day. When we wake up and try to look at an object, if you want to see it more clearly, you take it close or far in space. We think back and forth in time all the time to orient ourselves in the present moment. And I think what my work tends to do is exaggerate these gestures. So looking could mean looking at the world horizontally around us. When you see people and places, and those are full of stories, from which a painting like this might emerge, baggage claim, where essentially the figure of the body becomes also the carrier of the city. So the habitat and the inhabitant become one, if you look at the sort of hair of the citizen, and replete with stories. But the other tendency would be to kind of to shift the gaze, to look up or down. And if you look at the sky at that same moment, there's another narrative out there. There's eons of time looking back at us at the same time. And this happens in work such as this piece is called Sightings. And sightings, when you stand in front of it, appears like intergalactic vistas, like images of supernova explosions. But what these are essentially are fruits. These are all fruits. They are papaya, pear, blueberry, plum, fig, mango. What's happening on these surfaces is that, for instance, this is a papaya fruit, where if you move in front of it, it flips. And in the change of the colors from the color of the fruit as we see it into its own negative, it reveals an entire galactic image within it. and one could think back from the fruit into the skies and realize that it's nothing but starlight that becomes a fruit, that becomes a body, that allows us to speak. So there's an energy field that cycles through us through this, and images might be a way to kind of understand this. So these probably are two tendencies in space, but I think if we probably go to the next image, there's another aspect of the work which is often moving back in time or moving forth in time. So this particular work becomes an example of a certain return to history. This is a piece called Public Notice 3 at the Art Institute of Chicago, a building which in 1893 used to be an auditorium. And on 9/11, 1893, Swami Vivekananda delivered the speech calling for end of fanaticism, fundamentalism, bigotry. All of these words were actually spoken on 9/11, but 108 years before the attacks, at what happened to be the first parliament of religions, exactly 108 years before religion stood exposed as the new battlefield on 9/11, 2001. And we all know that 108 in our wisdom traditions is essentially a very powerful number. So a work like this overlaps site and date to really think back through a moment in history to perhaps allows us to kind of rethink the present moment in some ways. So I think these are broad stroke tendencies, I would say, ways in which I tend to try to understand the world through shifting in time and space so that we can find some orientation in this moment in our world.
Reena, what about you?
I mean, Aparajita, we were talking about, like thinking of how, as a child also you think of artists' lives, and there was no understanding of art. So many of us, even today, I think we still continue to face the gap, because in India, there aren't any institutional spaces. Children don't grow up in the culture of museums. And there is a general disconnect, which unlike in other places, you'll find even in small towns, there's a great connect with the arts. So this whole desire, when I think of now as I look back, I think my work has so much to do with memory that plays a central role in a lot of the work I make. And whether it's to do with one personal history, there's a political history, there's a social history. When all of these, I think anyone is an artist. It's just like today when we speak of art, we think of just a shift in the imagination of when you see an object, and here what you're seeing are portraits which are made of rubber stamps. I mean, again, rubber stamp is a found material, but these are customized with names of people who've gone missing in various zones, north, south, east, west, central zone, forming portraits of migrants. And like I said, there's the layering of, in one sense, there's a personal history of my father having been born in Lahore, having moved to Punjab, and his brothers having to move post-partition, which in those early years I didn't realize would have a bearing on my practice. But as I look back now, even in the 90s, our whole experience of living in the city had changed, and one began to think about that moment of partition and the legacy of partition that continues to live on with the sort of strains in relationships between communities, and whether it's Hindus, Muslims, for me at one point, I actually felt like going back to the preamble of the Constitution of India to sort of look at how our sort of secular values and those were being challenged. So, I mean, I think art also allows you to rethink and sort of try to understand the world through. So in this case, I mean, like I was saying, that these are portraits of migrants, and there was some sort of identification with somebody who left everything behind, or the names, and that naming became a central part of a work that I did, body of work between like a decade and a half, using the rubber stamp as a bureaucratic apparatus that both endorses, legitimizes, gives state sanction, or stamps histories out of existence. In this case, they are names of people who've been denied visas to various countries, forming these flight routes or sort of setting them free. And while there's so much to talk about these works, but I think this motive of trying to bring together conflicting sides runs through the work. So in this case, Hyphenated Lives is a body of work where I form these hybrids, where one half of each animal, bird, tree comes from countries that are politically partitioned or in conflict. So they are national symbols which were meant to unite people from a region or a geography, but often become points of contestation and conflict where they're claiming ownership to natural forms. And so here it's a coming together of all of these hybrids to form one large piece that actually carries a lot of these ideas. And in this case, Leaking Lines, again, is a work that actually thinks of this line that was drawn across territory, and what does that mean? Line being such an essential part of an artist's toolkit. But all of these are lines that were drawn, whether it's the Radcliffe line between India and Pakistan, or the Durand line between Afghanistan, Pakistan, or you have the McMahon line, the Mannerheim line, Maginot line. So there are all of these that actually one thinks of how histories have shaped geographies over time. And in this case, I work with the electric cable, which is again a transmitter of energy exchange. But I think the medium in some case drives the message, or the potential of the medium really takes you further, or in some cases, it's really the content that you look for a form for.
Reena, is it possible for you to talk about the next work, which I know is very close to your heart?
So yeah, rather, this is a piece called Walls of the Womb, which is a very personal piece I made, post my sort of turning into motherhood in 2005. And I was going back to my early childhood years of having grown up with all the things my mother left behind, her belongings, her personal belongings that remain in wardrobes for nearly 30 years. And I sort of started to bring them out. And at one point, I decided to make translations from her handwritten recipe books. I mean, so much of early motherhood is about nurturing, nourishing. And I decided to translate them into Braille, into the language of the blind, but forming them with tie and dye. So I work with craftspeople in Gujarat, in Kutch, Khatri families that actually helped me make the tie and dye. Because I wanted the viewer to face the kind of inaccessibility to the text, much like my own relationship with her, which was built through inscrutable fragments of memory. And I just thought of how language really fails you, and the sort of limitations of language in being able to communicate deep emotions of loss. And yeah, so that's one of the works that really it was also a moment of really allowing myself to be able to speak about it, because for years I couldn't even talk about the past. It was something that I'd really tried to bury behind, and it really was a cathartic experience to make this work. So I really believe in the transformative capacity of art to not only serve for an artist, but also what it does to the viewer who decodes the work.
I know, I know that when I look at and engage with this work, I think of my mother instantly, and the feeling of my childhood. Jitish, I know that this particular work is also something which might be the largest work that you've ever made, but could you talk a little bit about Epilogue?
It's interesting to see these two works in juxtaposition, Reena's Walls of the Womb and this work. I mean, in some ways, I would say that if Reena hadn't made Walls of the Womb, I don't know if I would have actually been able to breach my own hesitations about making a work like this, because it came out of a very unexpected moment. I was installing an exhibition in London where on one side was this image of a lunar cycle, a large light box. And on the other side was this image of 108 shirt pockets called The Cry of the Gland. These two works, for me, didn't have any connection with my father when I made them. But standing in this gallery, installing a show, all I could think about was my father, as I kept thinking about memories of him holding his chest. And I always thought that his chest was hurting. He had a heart condition. So all these images played out. When I came back to the studio, I wanted to see every moon that my father saw. And it took me 9 months after I actually had all the moons in my study to actually move to the next phase, to actually make the work. So actually, when you walk into Epilogue, what you see is a corridor that seems to go on and on and on. And it looks like the same image repeated many times, the image of a lunar cycle. But none of the two moons are the same. They're actually all the 22,888 moons of the 63 years of my father's life, becoming cycles of fullness and emptiness as the moons go from full to new moon to half moons. Each of the moons are actually rotis. So they're actually 22,800 meals, a progressively eaten roti becoming a crescent moon and an uneaten roti remaining a full moon, becoming cycles of abundance and dearth that runs through certainly his life, but I think any life goes through those cycles.
And what
Oh,
about
oh yeah, of course. Yeah, this actually for me was, I mean, it took me a long time, Prajita, to kind of think about, anytime I showed epilogue, most people took the moon of their birth or the moon of their loved one onto their cell phone. And to me, I realized that most people are living that work through the moon related to them. But it took me a while to kind of understand, and I always had this desire that could an artwork speak directly to somebody, to them as in first person. So this is a work called Continuum, which actually just happened after 10 years after Epilogue. And the central moon in this case, this is a work I made for my son, is the moon of my son's birth. The next moon is the night of the next night thereon, until 30 nights later, the moon previous to his birth corresponds to the moon after his birth, and it becomes a full cycle. And so anyone who has Continuum anywhere in the world actually has a moon of a birth of a loved one, a father, mother, or their own birth. And thus the work becomes central to them.
So, coming to the next question, which to me was a lot of fun, was actually given that you all are married to each other and both great artists, can you tell us, Reena, about a work of Jitish's that you like the most?
Covering Letter, which of course was very recently shown at the Venice Biennial in the India Pavilion, is a work that I felt had really arrived at a point where, because seeing Jitish working with all the material that he's been thinking of for a long time, this was of course a correspondence that then the kind of the way it got externalized was, to my mind, a very successful piece in the sense that you actually inhabit it. So as you walk into the space, you enter a dark corridor, and all you view is a shaft of light, which is actually mist. And as you step up close, you see, the text sort of rising over the mist, and you begin to see that it's a letter, and the person who's sort of addressed to, and the person who's actually written the letter are some of the the two sort of very known, or people who, one of the greatest proponents of peace, Mahatma Gandhi, writing to Adolf Hitler 5 weeks before World War II. And to my mind, I mean, this is a work that the viewer actually stands between this correspondence, physically inhabiting that space. And I think that's where I would think, that for, as an artist, I think you feel that the viewer really completes the work in the sense of the kind of reflective quality that this piece has, that as a viewer, you stand between both these and the meanings that it generates in the sense and the experience of what you carry back. So a lot of other people spoke of what mist could have also meant to them. And those are the layers of meaning that also are derived through the experiences that people collect over time. And I think that's a really successful work. And it's a work that's been widely shown. It was shown at the Philadelphia Museum, went to the Kiev Biennial, and of course has been shown in Delhi at the NGMA and the Prince of Wales Museum in Mumbai, besides MCA, Sydney, and so on. So it's one of my personal sort of favorites of Jitish's works.
And Jitish, if I may ask you to do the same honor to Reena to tell us about which of her works you liked the most.
While Reena could easily decide on which one, I took a bit of time to think of which one for Reena. But I think because I had multiple ones that I could have easily thought were as important to me as the other. But I think Woven Chronicles, partly because I I didn't think she could make it the way she did. I think for me that was so powerful to see that we were all in Gothenburg. It was for Ahan and me, my son and me. It was a family holiday. She was busy working and researching on a project for the Gothenburg Biennial, and I would see her every day kind of work with these wires, and I knew that she wanted to weave them in a certain way. So this is a work called Woven Chronicles. This is when it was shown at MoMA, New York. Woven Chronicles essentially begins with an electric wire, but the wire is woven in a way that it starts becoming a barrier, almost like a barbed wire, and then on to become a fence, all at the same time. And if you look at it from a certain distance, it also looks like wool and knitwear. And I think the transformational material at each station of its transformation seems to generate new forms of meaning. So for instance, here, a wire which is a conduit, which allows, us to link the world with information, electricity, or whatever else, becomes barriers in a world that is progressively connected, but also moving apart at the same time. So we are seeing this tribalism alongside our globalism at the same time. And I think in her work, you have these lines that become actual forms of migration that then get pinned up and drop down like woolen. And I think they almost become like a garment, map, a territory, barricade, all at the same time. And then they also have the sound element where sounds of migratory birds, sirens, animate this entire plane. So it's a work that sort of powerfully draws you in many, many ways. And again, it's been widely seen from MoMA to Art Gallery of New South Wales to ICA Boston, Site Santa Fe. I mean, it's just journeyed, and it just still continues to journey from institution to institution. Even now, I think there are some 3 stops in the US this year alone. So I think it's really a powerful piece. Yeah, I think I'd go for this one.
So, one of the things that we really had wanted to do with our audiences was actually to enter your studios and more than where we are right now from your office space, and actually see works that have been happening. Oh, there's echo. I do recognize that this is not your main studio and that we've all been restricted with movement, and hence there isn't as much as one would see in your bicolor studio. But if we could go around and if you could take us close to some of the working images and maybe tell us a little bit about what inspires your, like the process of the way you come to a piece, that would be really wonderful. So, Reena, should we start with you?
Sure. Should I? Let me see how I can do this. Okay, so this is where I'm working out of at this point. Like we said that, we're not really having the studio that we usually work in. This is a place right across from home. And some of these are just notations that I made before I made the sculptures, which are actually going to Hayward Gallery in London now. These are called Chorus, which is actually, they're based on pre-radar acoustic devices that were built during the wars. And they look really like strange looking objects, but they're actually meant to track sounds of enemy aircrafts. And I wanted to subvert those notions of war by having bird sounds. So when you go up close, you listen to sounds of birds from countries that are partitioned in communication. And I think that's one of the underlying themes. I mean, I constantly look for, this was shown in Wolfsburg in Berlin, in Germany, sorry. And these are all hyphenated lives where, again, I was saying, where one half comes from each side of the border to form these hybrids. But I do end up working a great deal with, like, I look for the many bonds beyond the borders. Essentially, I'm images in forms. So the cypress tree and the oak tree from Mexico.
Are we having a Wi-Fi issue there?
Yeah, I think she's moved away from the Wi-Fi.
Yeah. Oops.
You know,
She repairs so seamlessly.
Reena, you've gone.
I think for me, this is in this question,
So
what is
yeah,
art?
they sort of come together more seamlessly.
Shit.
When
In
your
other,
wife's voice starts sounding like a piano, that's art.
Yes. You'd better say that, Jitish. Otherwise, you're not getting any meals.
Wi-Fi mediated art.
Yes. I don't know how. Is there a way of communicating with her that she's not
I'll have to run downstairs.
audible?
I can do that.
Or
Or,
maybe
or
we can,
I will start moving through, and when she's easily walked through, she'll return back to
yeah,
her.
I think so. So we gonna begin?
Yeah. Okay, I'll start.
have I lost you guys?
Sorry, there she's come back.
Have I lost you guys?
Yes.
Yeah.
Your video is off as well.
Have
Okay,
I lost you guys, or am I?
Yes.
We have lost you, Reena. We don't have any video of you.
Oh, you don't have.
No.
Okay.
Now, I don't think you should move very far away from where you are, because there's clearly a Wi-Fi lag wherever else you are. So do you want to tell us about this work, and if you can go close?
So these are new works that I'm working on called Leaking Lines, where again, like a lot of the work is based around rivers, where one thinks of how rivers have not only connected civilizations but also often you share resources, and the sharing of waters often results in the partitioning of the rivers. And so these are from various places. This is the Jordan River. These are there's this Shat al Arab. There's the Tista River between Bangladesh and India. And I'm like I said, I work with the electric cable as one that's both connects us, but also then has these inherent contradictions of being fences but I think because our connectivity is so poor, maybe I'm going to just take you through a little glimpse, and I'll let Jitish do the rest.
So are these working images right now, Reena? Are you working on this one, or is it just there and you're going to process it later?
So these are works that actually have gone to Zurich, to the Migros Museum. Like, this is another body of work called Siamese Trees, where again one half of each side form one body. Often there are ideas of land, body, rivers, and veins, where one makes these analogies. And I think primarily, Aparajita, one is thinking of how, like I said, it's about the sharing of whether it's resources that land and water will become the primary resources, and often the courses of rivers are being changed and manipulated, and how that affects the sort of relationship between countries. And I think, this body of work you will soon see in what you're going to do at Nature Mart. So we leave it for then, and I'll just take you through a quick glimpse through the studio, because I think it's important we have time for questions.
I know. So actually, I'm going to ask to move on with Jitish, because we have a few minutes, and then we've got a couple of questions that we'd like answered. So Jitish,
Sure.
I think you can take us through.
Sure.
I think we have time for maybe 2 works.
Oops, sorry. So for instance, this is a piece called Rain Study. And, if one really goes close, it almost begins to appear like a star field. But the rain studies really are a result of the paper entering a passing rain moment, when the descending raindrops actually begin to settle. And this is the time, the date, the hour, the month. So it's called rain study, the hour of the day of the month of the season. The minute within which rain was deposited to become this image of a kind of interstellar space kind of image. I'm going to go very quickly.
We have lots of questions as well.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Should I go closer to these ones?
Yeah, this is quite intriguing. I think you're making them right now, right?
Yeah, these are the most recent.
We lost. Jitish, I think we lost you as well. Till Jitish comes back, Reena, should we pose some questions?
Yeah, should we start taking some questions? Here we are facing technology snags.
Issues. So Shraddha has said that we're understanding the work and appreciating it because it's explained. What do we look at in an artwork if we do not know anything about it? What are your suggestions, Reena?
I always feel that, one needn't be afraid of necessarily following the artist's intention, because I think that, each of us have a relationship with things around us, which is what really sets us apart from the others. So you might respond to color, you might respond to, an association that it evokes in you. And I think that's, you follow your intuitive sort of connection with the work, and it doesn't necessarily have to be driven by what the artist or the expert in art has to propose. And you can, your observation can be equally valid, because I think the first fear is always about, am I doing this right, have I got, while the context really does inform, while it's nice to get certain leads about what the work, where it stems from, because place, context, site can be great determinants of where the work is really, the impulses, the motivations come from. But I find that people often hesitate because they feel that maybe what they're seeing is not correct. There is nothing incorrect about they're bringing to it another layer of meaning. And I find that very enriching as an artist when people draw certain connections that were not thought about by me.
We have another question by Ananya, which asks, which artists would you say are your role models and inspiration? Which artist's work speaks to you the most? So I think I'll ask both of you the same question. Reena and Jitish, you could start, and then maybe Reena could go.
It keeps changing all the time. On a particular day, it's really somebody else. I know Reena probably would say Mona Hatum, but right at this very moment, I thought of Mona Hatum. But there can be just so many. I was thinking of Frida Kahlo a lot yesterday. She's not somebody I think of all the time. And so I think there's just, people like that who sort of emerge because there's an entire pantheon or a canopy of artists and artistry that we sit under in a way, and at different moments, different artists connect. So I don't really know. There's not a list that pops up like that, but these are just two names that came up just as thoughts, like yesterday and today.
Reena, what about you?
I mean, if I have to think of my early years, I used to be like really, very, very drawn in by the work of, say, Jenny Saville, who I don't think of today, or Christian Boltanski. There's Anish Kapoor. There was, Louis Bourgeois. There was, within India, I would think of like Nalini Malani, Vivek Sundaram, Sudhir Patwardhan. There's like Jitish said, there's a huge pantheon of artists. I mean, Arpita Singh, Mrinalini Mukherjee's hemp works. There were different works at different points in time, or Jenny Holzer, the text-based work, because of how it manages to raise sort of, in public space, how it sort of engages people. And that's something that I feel is so successful about different artists' work having, different aspects to them.
So we have a question from Devika Swaroop, and she asks, before you start a new work, do you pre-decide what it's going to be about, or does this come to you as you engage in the process of making? So Jitish, do you want to take that one?
One often knows very little. So I don't know when the Wi-Fi decided to leave me, But but for instance, at this moment, I know that all I know about this new drawing I'm making is I know little. I know less about it than I know more about it. And the act of making the work is taking that less and becoming more. So I think we are always at this sort of threshold of the unknown. And I think that is the only portal to art, because anytime you see a known field, you don't go there. It's really when you try to breach the unknown. So I think in some ways, also the other thing that happens is the artworks that are most important to you are the ones that poses most questions to you. And they often procreate more art out of questions. So I think that's really how it goes. It's a occupational hazard to be in the unknown, I think, when you're an artist.
And Reena, did you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an organic, intuitive process. I mean, I often say that I feel like, there's all of these forces at play that actually are channelized through you. So often you feel that you're purely being a catalyst to an idea that's sort of, you're sort of soaking in from an environment and has the urgency to be answered. And that process of making is what allows you to get closer to understanding something. I think if everything was known before, the joy of really going ahead and making something wouldn't be as magical as getting closer to something that you don't quite understand. But it works both ways. Sometimes you kind of know clearly where you're going, but at other times it's very much holding the thread and going 4 steps ahead.
So we have two very interesting questions from great art collectors. So I'm going to ask that. The first one is from Mr. Harsh Goenka, who asks, do you find a different reaction from global versus Indian audiences to your creations?
Who do you want to take it up?
Jitish,
go ahead.
Okay. I think it's often, when we say global and Indian, I think that's also a very sort of widely diverse binary, because, it can be India and Korea or India and China or something like that. I mean, the globe becomes some other imagined thing, separate from India. Also, the other thing is we can't necessarily say, like, for instance, if we exhibit, if I had a solo in Beijing, I am unable to meet people in a neighborhood of Beijing that would be necessarily outside the art world in the 1 week that I spend there. So it's very, very hard to tell, because when you travel internationally with your exhibitions, you're often meeting people within the art world. And to that extent, I would think that people, I think broadly in the art world, understand art through certain tools. But that said, there's of course a shift in meaning that happens with the artwork more than the audience, because I recall a piece of mine such as Aquasaurus, when it went from India to Australia, people thought about, which is this large water tanker shaped like skeletal bones, they all thought about the water crisis in Australia, which is remotely not even something I was thinking about when I made it. So I think the artwork tends to generate meaning in different audiences for you. And that's a sort of very powerful relationship, really, because you learn so much about your work and the world through the artwork in some ways.
Reena, anything you'd like to add to
that? Harsh, that's a really question that even as an artist you ask yourself, because a lot of times you feel that if the work is so embedded in history, and for those who they're not familiar with the sort of history of India, do feel like they have less access to the work. And that remains something that one is always grappling with, whether how much to provide in terms of the context of the work. But having said that, I think what Jitish said also reminded me of one of my experiences of taking a work with salt to Korea. And I was constantly trying to think about what it would mean to them. Salt as an element of sustenance, it extends life as a preservative. And I was thinking about it, of how it sort of, that it sort of means to ward off evil in Buddhist practice. And while I went there, and they were thinking about Gandhi's usage of salt, and that completely shook me up to think of, to turn the focus on what it means to my work, where a pinch of salt really brought down an empire. And maybe this is a way of trying to re-evoke texts that should not be forgotten, and that generated new meaning into my work. So I really find that a very enriching two-way process of what you put out there and what comes back to you through the experience that people have and how they layer the work.
The next one is from Dr. Swati Piramal, and this is, I think, for you, Jitish. How much research do you do before starting to work, for example, about the cosmos?
Thanks, Swati, and also thanks, Harsh. I was thinking of him when the image of the art school days flashed. One of the works right there was from his collection. So, but Swati, coming back to the cosmos, I mean, I don't really set out to research in the research manner that I would do if I'm writing like an academic paper. But what happens with art is often there is really I would call it a search rather than a research, because a search is when you're sort of wide-eyed, open, and you're also opening yourself as a field within which some of your questions might get mirrored through answers. Because when you do research, you also feel like you're doing some kind of time-bound activity. Like it took 10 years for the 3 public notice trilogy to happen. It took 7 years for the first covering letter to become the second one. And I just let time pass through the search to become the work. So in a way, so while there are interests, while there's reading, while there's all of that, I don't think of that as directed towards the work. It's finally the work that has to direct itself towards things that I know, to find out things that I don't know. So it's some kind of a journey in which some ways as an artist, all you can do is repeatedly back off from things you know.
And now finally from Mrs. Neena Kothari, how do you influence and critique each other's work style? Now, be careful about how you answer.
I'm ruthless. I'm a ruthless critic.
Yeah. So Reena, go for it first.
I feel sorry for Jitish. He gets battered because he also throws a lot of his tacky ideas at me, whereas I spare him of that. And he very, very openly, constantly loves sharing things, and I have to keep shutting the doors at him. So often it's a very he's more generous with sort of giving me a listening ear, but that's also because I very rarely ask him, and only when I'm ready and willing to share something with him, that I allow him into that space. Whereas Jitish is much more like out there trying to test ideas on me.
Reena always protests that, especially, when I'm painting, I know our studio, the actual studio, is a bit like a panopticon. From where Reena sits, she can see everything I do, through different windows and sight lines. So, and she doesn't look. So I have to always call her down to visit me. And then she would be like, she would come downstairs and often wonder, she'd say, like, what do you ask me this question? And over time, I've actually acknowledged that I'm not asking because I want to actually know exactly what she means. But I think the energy that her presence or moving through that studio means is that it sort of shifts what I am thinking. So sometimes you actually joke, and I would often get reprimanded that if I said this to you, why didn't you do it? I said, by the fact that you said something to me has transformed something else. So that's the reason I keep calling on her. So yes, I do knock on her much more than she does to me.
That's a perpetual grouse because we don't really listen to each other and take the criticism directly.
But the power to me is in the asking, not in the listening. When it comes to art, because you ask the question of anybody, and I'm not saying this disrespectfully, but when we ask each other, you can ask really anybody, but really we know what we mean to each other. But the answer comes from the artwork. I ask you, absolutely. And I turn to the artwork to answer it.
No,
thank you guys so much. We've gone up from time, and I'm so conscious about everybody's time on a Saturday. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for logging in and being so engaged and allowing us to share a glimpse of our journey with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I don't know how to exit this now. That's the thing. You didn't do that before. I think they exit.